Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Toronto by Chris Alexander. He was Canada's Minister of Citizenship and Immigration under Trudeau's Conservative predecessor, Stephen Harper. Also in Toronto is Keith Stewart. He's a senior energy strategist for Greenpeace Canada. And in Vancouver, we have Chief Bob Chamberlin. He's the Vice President of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. There's so many players in this. I'm looking at who's involved here. You have the British Columbia government. You have the Alberta government, you have the federal government, there's the oil pipeline itself and Kinder Morgan, the company from Texas. You have those who want it, mainly in Alberta, those who do not want it, which includes Indigenous Canadians or First Nations, Vancouver residents, and so on and so forth. So this is fascinating. So many moving parts, so many people involved here. Let me start with you, Keith Stewart. Tell me why you do not want this pipeline to be built.
Well, the oil and gas sector is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. It's the fastest rising source, and it's, if we continue to build new pipelines which allow the expansion of the tar sands, which is, again, major source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, then we won't be able to achieve our climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. This pipeline would increase emissions by sort of 13 to 15 million tons per year, according to Environment Canada. That's about the same as the reductions we anticipate from the national carbon tax that Trudeau is bringing in. So it's kind of one step forward, one step back. We also think it's really important for Canada's sort of national effort for reconciliation with Indigenous people that we respect the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And this pipeline simply doesn't have it. So for climate reasons, for human rights reasons, Indigenous reconciliation, it's just the wrong way to go. We need to be investing in a green economy that's going to bring those types of jobs to Canada, not trying to keep the oil industry on life support.
Chris Alexander, that's quite a strong argument from Keith Stewart, isn't it?
Well, I agree absolutely that we need to keep embracing a green economy, green industries, including green energy. But the solution isn't to shut down one of Canada's most vibrant, most successful, most globally competitive industries. We have the third largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Saudi Arabia produces twice as much as we do, Venezuela less, but it's a dictatorship with very little investment. We're the only major oil producer that cannot get its product to global markets. We do not have today a major oil pipeline either to the Pacific or the Atlantic coast. We are prisoners beholden to the US economy on this. We sell our oil to them at a discount. That disadvantages Canada. It disadvantages our ability to protect our environment. It disadvantages the world because Canadian oil is recovered, is produced in a more environmentally sound way than anywhere else in the world. It's ironic that because we're not able to supply our own needs, our imports from Nigeria, Algeria, Venezuela have increased in recent years, and I don't think they're doing anything for the environment. It would be far better if we could get our oil, our responsibly produced oil, to market at world market prices.
Okay, so Chief Bob Chamberlin, I wanted to bring you in third, and I'll tell you why. No disrespect to Keith Stewart, but Keith, we knew what you were going to say. I mean, you're Greenpeace, right? So I sort of figured out what you were going to say. You were going to be anti this. But Chief Bob Chamberlin, after you heard what Chris Alexander had to say about the economic argument and talking about clean, green energy, are you swayed by any of that as a First Nations leader?
The challenge that First Nations people face in Canada is something that has been going on for generations. And this is First Nations people being prisoners of democracy. For far too long, the Canadian governments have put the needs of everybody else ahead of that of the human rights of First Nations people here in Canada. And I want the international community to know that as a result of the Canadian government embracing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, this is an appropriate step for Canada to advance beyond its colonial past of oppression of First Nations people. And now with the tension point today, of course, is the Kinder Morgan pipeline. But unless the Canadian governments, both federally and provincially, change how they do their business and create the appropriate space and place for First Nations governance, to be able to provide consent or non-consent, that this is going to play out again and again and again. And this is as a result of the evolution of Canadian law in relationship to First Nations people. And so the challenge is for the government to get consent along a very broad path of a pipeline.
Right. And Chief, given that the federal government so far does support this pipeline, if Trudeau goes ahead with this, do you believe that it would unravel some of the good work done on Indigenous reconciliation?
It is certainly going to cause a lot of damage in terms of the credibility of the government and its statements to the international world of embracing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Of course, First Nations have wanted consent in their traditional territories all the way through the history of Canada, but the governments have ignored their own case law from the Supreme Court of Canada and the Constitution of this country in order to continue on with the pursuit of economy over top of the human rights of Aboriginal people in Canada.
Okay, so Chris Alexander, is it a case of economy versus human rights and environment?
Well, listen, the Chief has an extremely good point here. There is a legacy of abuse. We're still dealing with the residential schools legacy, which is tragic for all of Canada and for First Nations in particular. We are still dealing with British Columbia, one of our largest provinces, where most territory is still unceded, where most First Nations no longer have treaties with the Crown in Canada, and that is long overdue for resolution. My view, and I think the view of many, probably the majority of Canadians, and indeed of First Nations, is that we should use the opportunity of this pipeline expansion to build that consent, to strengthen that dialogue, to improve that conversation. We're not going to get a better chance. This is an existing pipeline. It's been there for over 70 years, only 300,000 barrels a day of capacity. The project is to take it to 900,000 barrels along the same route,
right? But I mean,
more or less.
But when you're saying it's an existing pipeline, sorry to interrupt
route.
you. I mean, they're building a new one alongside it to boost capacity, right? So this is $6 billion US. It's an expansion project.
Correct.
It's a new pipeline running alongside it. You can't say it's an existing pipeline, right?
Well, I'm saying there is an existing pipeline. This one will take the same route. So it's not breaking new ground. There is some consent for that route to date. Right. And there are First Nations, like the Simk First Nation around Kamloops, which has whose traditional territory accounts for 1/3 of the pipeline route, who are strongly in support, as are the Chipewyan First Nation around Edmonton, where the oil sands themselves are largely located.
Keith, I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to come to you in a minute. I just want to get a response from Chief Bob Chamberlin. Chief, there is consent from other First Nations tribes, and that's Chris's point. There's no unanimity amongst the First Nations when it comes to the route of the pipeline because it's following an existing route.
The Canadian government has made commitments to all First Nations, not just the First Nations that are approving of this project. Of course, there are First Nations that are supportive of this. They've weighed the benefits against the impacts to their territory, and that needs to be respected without question. But at the same time, the First Nations that have clearly said no and have not provided the free, prior, and informed consent, that also must be respected, because ignoring the answer no is a perpetuation of Canada's long sordid history in the denial of Aboriginal people the proper authority in their territories. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge for the Canadian government is that this pipeline covers or goes through First Nations territory that are both in favor of it and also opposed to it. So that's the challenge. But the Canadian government must make appropriate steps so that First Nations all across this country are able to have their human rights recognized and the authorities and decision makings that they have in their territories to be respected.
Right. Keith, is there anything that they could say to you to make you reconsider? If they could say, we're going to have as few emissions as possible, we're going to mitigate all factors to ensure that there won't be any oil spills when it comes to all the tankers and so on and so forth. Can they make an argument to go ahead with it in a clean, green way at all?
We're basically saying when we build something new, and we're going to spend billions of dollars to build new energy infrastructure, we need to be building renewable energy, energy efficiency, not expanding fossil fuel production. We do have the third largest reserve of oil in the world in northern Alberta. It's also some of the highest carbon oil in the entire world. Taking that out, processing it is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. Putting billions in to keep that going for another 50 years, because that's how long you have to do this to make this pipeline economic, doesn't make sense at this moment. When Canada signed on to the Paris Accord, we said we want to decarbonize our economy. We want to get to net zero emissions by mid-century. Spending billions to increase production of fossil fuels at this time doesn't make sense when we desperately need that money for building the alternatives. That's going to create jobs, that's going to provide the energy that we need, that the world needs, but without destabilizing the climate.
So Chris Alexander, you can't be both. You can't be a leader on tackling climate change and also building mega pipelines. That's what Keith's saying. Isn't that true?
Yeah. Well, no, I think we can. I think indeed we must. If we were to shut down Canada's 5 million barrels per day of oil production, which is really what Greenpeace and others are advocating, that production would not disappear from the face of the earth. It would be taken up by others, by OPEC countries, by the United States, which is expanding production more than any other country in the world right now. And Canada would be importing for its needs on a far larger scale than we're doing. We also would see oil recovered in many of these countries in unclean, unsafe, environmentally unsound ways, much worse than any practice that we've ever seen in Canada. We should strive to be part of this industry. We should strive to be the cleanest, the best, the most environmentally responsible, and we know that we can do that. That's the way to stimulate the growth of our green energy sector, of our clean tech sector, which is already very strong. You don't rob Peter to pay Paul in achieving a safe, sustainable, environmentally sound life for us all on this planet.
Keith Stewart, if anybody's going to do it, we should be doing it, the responsible nations. What do you think?
Well, I mean, we know we're not going to shut down the oil industry tomorrow, but what we're saying is we have to stop expanding it. And this is an expansion project. So we can actually reduce oil use in Canada to reduce those imports that he's talking about, although we are one of the major net exporters in the world. But we have a responsibility.
But can I make the point?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just if this pipeline is not built to allow us to export to Asia, then that production is not going to stop. It's simply going to be exported to the United States, who may export to world markets themselves and reap the benefit of that, but who will definitely pay a discount for Canadian oil, as they've already done. I think that's a neo-colonialist approach that the U.S. is taking and that some in Canada are endorsing. We should not be prisoners to a single market. We should not be captive to one market. That's not the way markets work. That's the way colonies used to work, in a mercantile system from which we are trying to escape.
Chief Bob Chamberlin, you're shaking your head in disagreement. I'm going to get you to respond in a second. Keith Stewart first. Response from Keith, and then Chief Bob.
We have to be investing in reducing oil consumption, and that means more efficient vehicles. It means better public transit.
Agreed.
I think the arguments about is the oil going to the U.S. or to world markets is missing the point. If we actually sort of start reducing supply here, Greenpeace is working around the world to do this. Like a lot of Canadian politicians complain, why do you pick on us? Well, we're doing this all around the world. And what we're trying to do is say, we have to pick a path here. And if we're going to have a safe climate, that means rapidly reducing fossil fuel consumption, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to have a better future for our kids. And every country is saying, okay, yes, everyone else should take action, but not us.
Okay, right. Chief Bob Chamberlin, I want to give you the final word. Come in.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear your other guests speak about colonial approaches. And of course, that is what is being perpetuated here in Canada. And now that the Canadian government has embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, this cannot be accomplished or fulfilled in a meaningful way without having First Nations having a proper place in governance and decision-making within their territories. And it's time now for Canada to wake up and realize what's going on globally. And what we're talking about now is alternative energy sources. It's something that's a global occurrence. Canada has an opportunity to capitalize on that and all the employment that would come with it. And that could be something that would generate some resources for First Nations in various places around the country. But to ram through another pipeline, knowingly running over top of the human rights of Aboriginal people, I want to believe that Canadians and the world would find this unacceptable, that a government such as Canada would make a decision to run roughshod over the human rights of people. We have a very large immigrant base to this country, and many of them have escaped different places in the world where human rights impacts were occurring. And I call on them to stand up and support First Nations so that we have the authority to make decisions based upon our human rights.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we definitely have a deeper understanding of the issue after this conversation, and I'm really pleased that we have had it. Chris Alexander, Keith Stewart, and Chief Bob Chamberlin. I've got to move on, but I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.